Florida had a rough June in 2024. Well, more rough than usual anyway. The state is well known for being one of the most dangerous places as far as wildlife is concerned. Sharks, alligators, venomous snakes, black bears, panthers, and even the wild boars pose a significant threat. So it shouldn't be surprising that we get so many reports of deaths and attacks occurring from one of Mother Nature's favorite places to remind us of just how dangerous she can be. But June this year was an extreme month, even for Florida. In just 90 minutes, 3 back-to-back attacks from a single shark on a 4-mile stretch of beach in Walton County. It all started at 1 in the afternoon on June 5th, when Elizabeth Foley and her husband Ron were standing waist-deep in the water a few yards into the surf. Their children were seated on their towels, all tuckered out from a whole morning of swimming in the shallows. So when the couple finally had a moment to stretch out their arms, they took the opportunity. For a 45-year-old mother of 3, Elizabeth was very fit and active, and so was Ron. They made the swim out to the sandbank just beyond where the waves began in no time. They took a brief moment to catch their breath, and that's when the attack came. That second of standing still was all it took for the predator to hone in on a target. It rammed into Elizabeth out of nowhere, grabbing her around the waist. She was propelled forwards like a rocket, but luckily her reaction was instantaneous, and so was Ron's. The beast didn't even get the opportunity to drag her into deeper water, not with the frenzied blows raining down on its head from both its victim and her husband. In the crazed fight against humans and beast, it let Elizabeth go after a particularly hard punch from Ron. It reared back and went for her again, mouth agape and rising out of the water. Elizabeth raised her hands in defense, just as Ron slammed it on the side of the head. Its mouth snapped shut, right around Elizabeth's wrist, and it reeled away from the hit, taking her left hand with it. Ron didn't hesitate to pick up his wife and begin to wade her to shore with the help of several swimmers who rushed to them the moment they heard the screams. On the beach, 911 had already been called before they even reached the sand. Elizabeth was losing consciousness fast. The stump where her hand had been was spewing so violently that she was going to bleed out if they didn't do something fast. Ron grabbed the towels that were closest to him, made a tourniquet for the arm, and wrapped her shredded waist and buttock. All those first aid courses he took paid off big time. Elizabeth made it to the hospital in time. There was nothing that could be done for the hand that was deep in the ocean inside the attacker's belly after all. The wounds on her waist were no less serious. So far, she's had 3 surgeries and an extensive amount of muscle damage that can never be repaired. No matter how many hours of physio Elizabeth puts in, chances are that she'll walk with a limp for the rest of her life. Just an hour and a half after the first attack, while Elizabeth was well into her first surgery, the ocean stalker was back at it again. It had traveled 4 miles, and that single hand was just enough to awaken its appetite and make it realize that sandbanks just beyond the waves was a good place for hunting, and it wasn't wrong about that. Unfortunately, the news hadn't spread that far yet, and officials were just beginning to place warning flags and make the necessary calls to all of the lifeguard towers. 15-year-old twins Lulu and Ellie Gribben were out at a sandbank with their friend 17-year-old McCrae Frost. Like the Foleys, they were standing in waist-deep water, looking for sand dollars. There were a few other people on that bank too, so Lulu probably wasn't targeted specifically. She just happened to be the closest person to where the shark came rocketing out from the ocean. And again, the events played out almost identically to Elizabeth's. Lulu was grabbed by her right leg, and her sister and friend sprang into action, punching, kicking, and fighting the thing before it could slip back into the deep. The water instantly turned red, making it impossible to see where they were hitting. McCrae kicked her foot out wildly, connecting with the razor teeth that were still clamped around Lulu's leg. She didn't even feel the dozens of shards slice through her foot. She just kept going. Lulu, half under the water now and struggling for air, began to try to force the impossibly large jaws open, trying to pry them from her leg. In the madness and the pain, Lulu didn't even feel her hand being sawed through. Whether it was Ellie, McCrae, or another man that jumped into the fight, who struck the animal hard enough to drive it off, no one knows. One moment it had Lulu underwater and on its way to dragging her into the deep, and the next, it fled from the onslaught of more and more people jumping in to fight it off so fiercely. The man who jumped in to help scooped Lulu up in his arms and set out for the beach. Ellie and another stranger helped McCrae, whose foot had finally given out on her. On the beach, a crowd was already waiting for them, and there just happened to be 2 doctors and a nurse among them. Like a well-oiled machine, as if they'd worked together for years, the 3 had Lulu's leg and hand secured with towels and t-shirts. McCrae's foot was wrapped up too, and they managed to patch them up so well that when Lulu's mother arrived at the scene, her daughter was still conscious, and the wounds were no longer streaming out. If it weren't for those 3, Lulu would have bled to death long before the ambulance arrived. One of the doctors got into the ambulance with her. Still in his swimming trunks, he began to converse over the radio with the surgeons waiting at the emergency bay. He took off his trunks, threw on the surgical gown and boots, and assisted in the multiple surgeries that were taking place on Lulu at the same time. Just like Elizabeth, Lulu's left hand was completely gone. It was just a matter of sealing the stump and blunting the sharp ends of bone. For hours, the surgeons worked to save her right leg, but in the end they had to admit to themselves that there was just nothing they could do. The leg was amputated, and Lulu became a double amputee overnight. That evening, when the beach doctor finally walked out of the operating room, he found the other doctor and nurse from the beach still at the hospital, waiting for an update. It seems that a close friendship is already developing between the 3 people who'd been strangers to each other just hours before. Getting the paperwork sorted out with a surgeon who wasn't registered at that hospital was a bit of a headache, but since the family had no intention of contesting it at all, the details were sorted out eventually. McCrae's foot was almost overlooked in the chaos. By the time she got to the hospital on the second ambulance, they feared that her foot would be the 4th limb to be removed that day. But luckily, only 2 small bones were broken, and she needed more stitches than anyone thought a foot could hold. She's expected to make a full recovery. In the days that followed, the support flowing in from across Florida and the whole of the U.S. was almost a little overwhelming. Crowds holding vigils already gathered before Lulu was out of surgery, and they continued until her release. Churches in Florida were suddenly overflowing, and several institutions reported that they didn't have enough seats to accommodate everyone. The state felt like they needed to pray, both for the 3 victims and for the now missing attacker that was still out there somewhere. Because despite clearing the seas for 3 days and keeping lookouts stationed every mile along the shoreline, there's been no sighting of a fin or tail. Given the ferocity and sudden nature of the attacks, no one's been able to confirm the species or the size of it. The speculation, judging by the bite wounds, is that it's a bull shark, but that's all that anyone has to go on for now. Funds were raised, and in less than a week, all 3 women's hospital bills were paid for, and Lulu even had enough funds to fit her with prosthetics for both her hand and leg. McCrae is already back on her feet, albeit with crutches for the time being. But Elizabeth's husband only made one statement through their church, letting everyone know that she's recovering well, that she needs time with her family, and to prepare for the long road of physiotherapy that's lying ahead of her. One thing is certain, though. Only time will tell if the shark, that learned in just 90 minutes that humans can be prey, will decide to come back to the sandbanks where kids so often hunt for sand dollars, shells, and crabs. And if that Friday afternoon is anything to go by, the next person to get attacked might not be lucky enough to avoid their final affliction.